Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, Chief Executive of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. On tap this week, what happened to the foreign minister of China and the top of the rocket forces in China? Strange things happening. What is the leadership going as the country itself is facing all kinds of strains? Then we'll take a look at Ukraine. Earlier in the week, Ukraine met with 40 other countries in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to talk about the possibility of ending this war, even as the counteroffensive continues, though with little progress still to date. And then finally, Niger, another military coup in West Africa, is mobilizing the regional powers to try to stop it. But just as they threaten to intervene, they decide to step back. Here to talk about all of these stories are the reporters that are covering them. Catherine Philp is diplomatic correspondent at the Times in London. She joins us from London. Also from London, Jamil Anderlini, editor-in-chief of Politico Europe. And finally, Peter Spiegel, U.S. managing editor, joining us from Brooklyn. Jamil, let's start with you. This really remarkable story of the public disappearance that is if you can talk about that, the idea that a foreign minister can one day be leading conversations with his U.S. counterpart for 5 hours and the next day disappear. And then a week later, the head of the rocket forces disappears with his deputy as well. You've covered China in depth and would love to get your take on what you think is happening.
Yeah, thank you, Ivo. It's good to be here. So Foreign Minister of China named early this year, beginning of this year, his name was Qin Gang. And I actually knew Qin Gang very well because about 15 years ago, when I worked with Peter Spiegel at the Financial Times, I was my minder in the Foreign Ministry of China when I was based in Beijing was Qin Gang. So I actually got to personally know him relatively well. A lot of the meetings I had with him were him telling me off for things that I or the Financial Times had written. But I felt we developed a healthy professional respect for each other. And he was known as something of a wolf warrior, as the description of these more nationalistic, more pugnacious Chinese diplomats. He was in that category, but he was a reasonable wolf warrior, if you like. So he wasn't unreasonable or completely crazy. And he had this meteoric rise where he went from minding young journalists, journalists from the Financial Times, to being the head of protocol for Xi Jinping directly. So he developed this extremely close relationship with the chairman of the Communist Party of China, or chairman of China, and he thus, subsequently rose extremely rapidly. He became a vice minister, and then quite quickly he was made ambassador to the US I believe that was in late 2021. But last year I went to see him in DC as ambassador, and it was we had a very pleasant lunch. We caught up on old times, and it was very interesting. At that time, he was being frozen out by the U.S. administration, and he had a lot of time on his hands to lunch with old friends. But then earlier this year, he was named foreign minister, and I think the U.S. administration was a little bit regretful of how they'd frozen him out. Looked like he was on top of the world. He'd risen this, absolutely meteoric rise to the sort of pinnacle. He was a state councillor, which is, one of the top people in the government. He was a central committee member of the Communist Party. So he's really, he'd risen extremely fast. And he was seen as absolutely one of Xi Jinping's inner circle, someone, totally untouchable. And then he was gone. And he was gone, and we knew he was gone because successive foreign visitors like Joseph Borrell from the High Representative for International Affairs for the European Union, his visit was cancelled because no foreign minister. He's unavailable. And at first what happened is The foreign ministry said something about his health. He was unwell, or they then removed any reference to his health from the subsequent transcripts of the public's press conference where they said he was unwell. And then there was just sort of this limbo. In the meantime, a lot of rumors about his extramarital affairs, potentially a child born out of wedlock, potentially with a Chinese journalist from a Hong Kong Chinese propaganda outlet, basically, TV station. That person has gone missing with the child. That person had a child in America. That child's believed to potentially be the illegitimate child of the foreign minister. These things were all swirling. This was all getting a lot of traction and not being heavily censored inside China, where things are normally extremely heavily censored. So there's some sort of connection between the removal of the head of the rocket force. Just to be clear, the rocket force in the People's Liberation Army inside China oversees the nuclear arsenal inside China. The head of that force was removed. The commissar, the political commissar, the deputy, was also removed, and they've been replaced with people from other services, which has never happened before in the history of the rocket force of the People's Liberation Army. They're always traditionally the people who run that used to be called the Second Artillery. That has always, the people who head that up have always come from within that force. And now you have like someone from the Air Force and the Navy basically running that. It's very, very unusual. Again, in the same vein as the former foreign minister now being brought back to be foreign minister again, as well as still being a Politburo member. So what you have now is this, incredible, behind the scenes, something is going on behind the high walls of Zhongnanhai in Beijing, something very, very serious. And the fact that I hear a serious journalist, I would like to think, is basing my kind of analysis on Twitter rumors and phone calls from old friends in Beijing. I think that tells you something very worrying, I would argue, about the state of Chinese politics today. That, okay, yes, top level internecine battles between different factions have always happened inside the Communist Party of China, just as they happened in, Stalinist Russia. But in the past, we would have a little more transparency, a little more explanation. You'd be able to say, well, that happened because of that. And these days, I would say that the opacity of the Communist Party of China has reached, absolutely extreme levels. And I think that should be of great concern to all foreign investors, to any country, any business that is in doing any sort of dealing with China in any sort of way, or is thinking about dealing with China in any sort of way.
So, Jamil, just to clarify one thing. These three people who have been removed were all people who were closely tied to Xi Jinping himself, right? And so certainly the foreign minister was, but also the head of the rocket forces was put in charge under Xi Jinping as the major nuclear buildup has accelerated. And so if true, what does that say about Xi Jinping's standing and ability to maintain control?
So I would argue that it doesn't tell us very much about Xi Jinping's sort of his current grip on power. I think his grip on power right at the moment is off the charts. He absolutely has a very strict, tight grip on power inside the Communist Party. Does that mean that he will have in 6 months or in 3 years or in 5 years? No, because I think what happens in systems like this is that when the power, Ceausescu had a huge amount of power until he was executed. Power slips away from these dictators when it really starts to go. And so, but I think at the moment, everyone is petrified of Xi Jinping. It's absolutely true. Anyone at the top levels of the PLA is handpicked by Xi Jinping and has been for many, many years. The first thing he did when he came into power in 2012-13, the very first thing he did was visit all the military regions, purge the military completely. There's something like, the talk at the time inside Beijing, and I was in Beijing at the time, the talk was 200 top-level generals purged or executed or suicided, is what they said. There was a rash of being suicided at the time. So, so he can't say these are traitors that are not my people. These are his people who are potentially traitors. But I think what you can say is that the levels of paranoia of Xi Jinping's level of paranoia and the paranoia of the people around him has also reached extreme levels, along with the secrecy. Those things go together, basically. And so I think that what you're seeing is that the establishment is eating itself, right? You've got the Xi Jinping inner circle is turning on each other. They're deeply suspicious. They're under extreme pressure on the economy, on foreign relations, on, their most important relationship is actually the United States, and it is in the worst state it's been in since 1970. So Nixon went to Peking, so. And many people in China, the intellectual class for sure, would blame Xi Jinping for all of China's current issues. And he has encouraged people to blame him because he has taken such tight reins of everything. So, he wants to be given the credit, he wants to be in charge of everything, and he wants to have the credit for any successes in China. The problem with that is that you get blamed for everything when you're in charge of everything. So,
yeah, I mean,
Jamil, that was Spiegel knows as managing editor of the United States in the Financial Times.
Yes, I am blamed for everything. I don't get credit for anything. I was going to ask you basically that exact question. And again, it's going to force you to speculate a bit, but to try to attach the recent events to the more macro environment, which, as you said, because of the opacity, is probably an unfair question. But, in addition to the difficult relations going on with the U.S. right now, you do have, we seem to have forgotten about it, but there were, actually public protests, the largest since Tiananmen, in Beijing and other major Chinese cities only a few months ago because of this zero COVID policy. They had the reopening. The economy has not rebounded in any way people expected. As a matter of fact, we saw deflation in the latest economic data that came out earlier this week, I think. And I just wonder if you're, I mean, this again, maybe it's unfair and maybe you can just tell me it's a bad question, but I'm wondering if there's any way to connect the two, that you do suddenly see people, as Ivo said, who are at least ostensibly close to Xi, losing their positions at a time when the macro environment seems to be going very badly. Is there anything we can read into those two things happening simultaneously?
Yeah, I think absolutely. My analysis would be that these levels of paranoia are being stoked by the very real sense amongst the Chinese leadership that things are going in the wrong direction. And interestingly, Qin Gang, the foreign minister who's disappeared, when he came in as the foreign minister, he actually purged, on some level, the most vocal wolf warriors in the foreign ministry. So there was a guy called Zhao Lijian who was known for saying the Americans are evil, and really, really, really vitriolic spokesperson for the foreign ministry in Beijing. And he was moved. One of the first things Qin Gang did was move him to an irrelevant bureau, I think a Bureau of Oceanography or something like that. He was completely shoved aside. And that was seen as something of a move to mollify, to maybe like a gesture to we're not actually xenophobic, crazy, ethno-nationalist, expansionist, evil buggers here in Beijing. We're a bit more rational than that. And I think that you're absolutely right. As the pressure mounts on the economy, on international relations, on the nationalist project, they still don't have Taiwan. Xi Jinping's been saying, "I will get back Taiwan." That they've been supporting Russia. A lot of people in China don't think that's a great idea. Why are we hooking our wagon to those guys? Is that a winning strategy? So I think that all of these things are mounting pressure, and the paranoia level is rising, and Xi Jinping feels under siege, probably to a certain extent. And so you're seeing a bit of house cleaning going on.
Catherine, when you look at the scene, as Jamil describes it, one, if you have other information or different views, put it on there, but sort of take that and what should we be looking for in terms of Chinese behavior going forward, given the challenges and tensions that now exist within Beijing?
I think Jamil's point about the opacity is absolutely critical. The fact that we don't know, the fact that we have to rely on these rumors to even get any insight into what's going on, just shows how little we know. What you can't keep secret in a globalized economy is the economic data, and I think we've had a couple of references there to this deflation that's going on in China, which the government in Beijing is simultaneously denying is happening, plus trying to protect a message that actually deflation is not that bad. And that strikes me as being, a public order, a stability issue for the Chinese, which is what we know they care about above all. And in a state-managed economy like China's, that there is possibly even more emphasis on the government to sort it out than there might be in the West. You can't rely simply on capitalist forces to sort it out. You have all sorts of state-engineered factors playing into this deflation. The fact that there's a falling birth rate in China for decades, the fact that Chinese citizens aren't given investment opportunities beyond those in, say, property, which has been too much of which has been built, state intervention in pricing of property. These are so many distortions in the market that puts the CCP in the line of fire when it comes to who the Chinese population will put responsibility on for the economic wins that lie ahead.
Yeah, no, it's clearly the case that as you look at China, and just as I think in the United States and in parts of Europe too, there's the sense that this is a 10 feet tall challenge that we really need to take very seriously. There's the question of, well, maybe we need to take them seriously because it turned out they're only 3 feet tall, but they're pretending to be 10 feet tall, angry. and that can be a problem.
Right, and also, I think that also it's obviously worth considering as a factor in this how the behaviour of the Chinese government has pushed the West to try and unlink their supply chains from China. So there's this deflated demand for Chinese goods that's going to rebound on the Chinese economy and population. This is a direct result of China's geopolitical, very challenging behavior.
Yeah, no, great point, and we see that in the data because exports continue to fall. Chinese exports to the rest of the world continue to fall. In fact, imports are too. So that. When both fall, that's usually not a good sign for your economy. At least that's what I learned in Economics 101. And I never went further than Economics 101. But
the one area that is of light from the Chinese perspective when it comes to exports is auto exports. And that is a very new and very interesting trend. So it's auto exports, particularly electric vehicles. China has always been an importer of automobiles. And it's suddenly, in the last year or so, not even, turned into a mass exporter. I would argue that is going to lead to even more resentment and probably pressure to decouple from China, because as China floods Europe, US is a bit more protected by its own tariff system, but Europe in particular is going to be flooded by cheap Chinese electric vehicles. And that was one of the areas that particularly Germany, but France and the rest of Europe was trying to sort of say, we're going to be the future of electric vehicles. And I think that's going to build even more sort of backlash when it comes to dealing with China. And I just think that that will, again, the knock-on effects of that are even more pressure on the politics within China.
Eva, just one follow-up on Jamil's point there, since I'm the only one sort of here in the U.S. It is, as Jamil said, it has really complicated, I think, Washington's calculus here, because you've seen, was it yesterday, day before yesterday, the administration promulgated this sort of outward investment limitation, whatever you want to call it. So there's clearly yet more anti-China policy coming out of Washington, particularly on the Hill, which still remains bipartisan in its anti-China rhetoric. We're heading into an election year where there seems to be no one who's going to say anything nice about China. At the same time, you do see the effort by Yellen, by Blinken, to reopen something. And so they're really in a difficult position right now. I think there's a realization that there is an opening there, given the brittleness of the Xi regime, and can we take advantage of it? And yet, as Jamil said, the backlash in Washington is so severe, it's very, very difficult for anyone who is anything other than a China hawk to get any room to maneuver within the Washington policy debate right now. And I think that really has hampered the administration's ability to do anything creative on that front.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Catherine, you want to jump in, and then we're going to move on.
I just had I had a question for Jamil about whether this expansion of the Chinese over mining and processing rare earths, which is obviously a long-term challenge because it's not like others can catch up that quickly.
Absolutely. So, I was covering this 10 years ago or so. China came up with an industrial policy, and the idea was we're going to be the global leaders in these industries. There was a military list and there was a civilian list. The military list is a secret. I've seen various iterations of it, but the civilian list included things like electric vehicles. We're going to be the world's leader in electric vehicles. And that was a Communist Party plan from the top level of the Communist Party. It freaked out the businesses, the Western businesses that were doing business in China at the time, but there wasn't very much they could do about it. China had, the Communist Party is quite good at setting a plan and then executing over the years. And what it did was it went around the world and it bought up the supplies of things like lithium and nickel and cobalt and the things that you need. Some of them not very rare, but the things that you do need for batteries and electric vehicles. And so China has gone around, the Communist Party has used its free money from state banks and financial institutions, state-owned enterprises to secure these supplies in not so savory places and more unstable places, and now is in a position where Chinese electric vehicles are cheap. Chinese electric vehicles are flooding the world, and they've just begun to flood the world. And I think we can expect more of it, but we can also expect quite a serious backlash against that from many countries.
Yeah, no, I think this is a topic well worth thinking about. And in fact, I was in Japan not that long ago, and the Japanese car makers are also waking up to the reality. Of course, they were slower to embrace EV, particularly Toyota, than even the Europeans. So certainly something to watch. By the way, just a plug for Peter's paper. Very good piece in a couple of days ago on the Chinese cornering of those very critical material markets around the globe.
I'll also just say on that point that I do remember the last time I think I saw Jamil in person, that he was hosting me in Beijing when we were both at the FT together, and we went around and made the rounds with the Western businesses in China, and exactly what Jamil was just talking about, how freaked out they were that the Chinese had strategically decided to dominate these industries, and they've done it.
They've done it, but they doesn't look like Volkswagen and others have really adjusted, and Toyota and others have adjusted to that. Let's move on to Ukraine, Catherine, a subject you cover closely. Over the weekend, a very interesting meeting in Jeddah with over 40 national security advisors and political directors, hosted by the Saudis. The Chinese were there, the Indians were there, the South Africans and the Brazilians are there, of course, the U.S. and the European Union, and Ukraine, and not Russia. What did you take away from that meeting? What do you think the Ukrainians are trying to achieve? This is very much something the Ukrainians are seeking, and then we'll talk a little bit about the counteroffensive and what that is going to do for Western support. But sort of that meeting, I think, is talk about opaqueness. It was pretty opaque. Not a lot of media access into it, and be sort of interesting. How did you read it, and what should we take away from it?
Well, I would expect nothing less of a peace summit held in Jeddah, hosted by the Saudis. That in itself is in some ways extraordinary, other ways perhaps less so, because we know that Saudi Arabia is very keen to position itself as, this kind of convener and peacemaker. Ironic, perhaps, when Saudi is itself bogged down in a almost never-ending conflict in Yemen, about which we hear very little these days. Nonetheless, it was done in concert with the Ukrainians, who have been over, I would say, certainly since the beginning of the year, since they took back some of their territory from the Russians last year, have been trying to broaden their diplomatic appeal beyond that of of the West. Now, one of the narratives you hear amongst Western leaders is that the world is on Ukraine's side. Of course, it's actually not. The West is on Ukraine's side. So Ukraine is conscious that it needs to reach out beyond that base of allies it currently has to countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and the Gulf. And it did so at this meeting. Russia was cordially not invited. Interestingly, a previous similar summit held in Copenhagen, hosted by the Danes, China did not attend. So the fact that China came to this is a development, and possibly could not have been done without using an interlocutor like, or host like, Saudi Arabia. This is Ukraine seeking to isolate Russia diplomatically, and quite recently Zelensky pulled all of his ambassadors, his diplomats, senior diplomats, back to Kyiv, and had this sort of diplomatic offensive towards his own diplomats, where he said, we are only as strong on the battlefield as our relationships with our allies and our outreach to the rest of the world. So we have to work on that. Now, at the same time that is going on, this diplomatic counteroffensive, we're seeing this very tough Ukrainian counteroffensive on the ground in Ukraine, which is not going well. Perhaps we shouldn't expect it to go well. It's incredibly complex. I've seen it said that no army anywhere in the world has faced an offensive more complicated than this one in the last 8 decades. It involves a kind of combined arms maneuvering that Ukraine has no experience of. So they've only just learned how to do this. And no NATO country would be attempting what Ukraine is attempting now if they did not have air support. We did not give them the air support when they asked for it. We have now promised it, but it's going to take time to get there. So I think we see Ukraine positioning itself for the likelihood that there will be negotiations at some stage. And it wants to make sure that Russia is isolated. Critically, the point that it pushed in Jeddah, and apparently even convinced Russia of, was the issue of territorial integrity. Now, in some ways, that's an easy win.
You said Russia convinced China.
Sorry,
Yes.
convinced China. Now, that is, thank you. That is, of course, quite an easy sell to the Chinese in a sense, because they think that includes their right to take back Taiwan by force, to impose their rules on Hong Kong, irrespective of agreements previously made about the handover. So pushing that idea of territorial integrity and trying to pull other countries onto their side before anything else happens diplomatically, that's critical for Ukraine, given the way that the counteroffensive is going. I think that we'll see more of this. I think that Ukraine would like this to happen again in the autumn. And I think another locus for these kind of discussions will be at the UN General Assembly in New York in the autumn. I think that this is also part of the most extraordinarily complex jigsaw global chess game, however you want to put it. Saudi is trying to maintain its relationship with Russia. It's also seeking a deal with the US to recognize Israel, which the US would like to use to wean Saudi Arabia away from China and Russia. Let's not forget, China oversaw the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Russia and Ukraine. So there's so much going on here in terms of moving parts in geopolitics. And I mean, quite simply, I would say this really kind of brings us back to the way that the Ukraine war has, in many ways, upended the global order and the alliances that existed beforehand.
Kathleen, that's great. Really nicely explained the complexity of this conflict, both on the diplomatic side, which is changing in some ways because we are seeing these meetings, and to some extent on the political side. Peter, on the military side, I meant. Peter, sort of two things that for American observers were important. One is that the counteroffensive is not going well. And at the same time, the Biden administration yesterday released another supplemental request for $24 billion for Ukraine, 40 billion total. That's just to finish off supply for the year. They have money until the end of September, but they need it till the end of the year. Says something about their sense of the counteroffensive, perhaps. And then the Chinese not only showing up, but what I hear from my talks to folks in the White House, actually being quite constructive and open to continuing this dialogue. That the boycott of Denmark is now over, and they want to be part of this.
I mean, you raised the two, I think, most important points. One other thing, just I will say, that just to follow what Catherine was talking about, almost the most interesting thing about the Saudi meeting was it was a Saudi meeting. I mean, the fact that Saudi had the convening power to bring everyone together says a lot about Saudi MBS's diplomatic offensive, and frankly, the Biden administration's complete shift on Saudi as a pariah nation. But let's set that aside for the time being. But you've pinpointed the key thing here, which is the growing tensions, I think, and I witnessed, because I had made the rounds of Washington a couple of weeks ago too, between the Ukrainians and the Americans on the counteroffensive, and it's bubbled up in public in several ways. I mean, Catherine, you talked about the constant banging the table for air support by the Ukrainians, the need for ATACMS and long range missiles, and the Americans keep saying, well, guys, you're fighting a ground war that is 100 meters, not 100 miles. Can you please focus at the task at hand? Would you please stop asking for F-16s and for ATACMS? You have an issue at hand that you're not dealing with. The other thing that seems to be going, and this is more than off the record conversation I've had than stuff that's bubbled in public, is, as Catherine, as you said, there has been training of the Ukrainian military to do combined arms and a more NATO style of warfare, and that was what the Americans had hoped they would do. What seems to have happened is the minute they hit toughness, including these minefields, they've gone back to old style Soviet version of warfare. And there's a generational thing here too, where the West at Grafenwehr and elsewhere have trained a younger generation of military leaders, and yet the general officer corps is still very old school Soviet style. And so suddenly the younger guys who were trained up to do a bit more of the combined arms are now getting led by a general officer corps who just wants to keep doing missile attacks, march, in coordination against a standing defensive position. And there was a real frustration I am sensing in Washington. It's not across every building, White House, State, Pentagon, but there is pockets of real annoyance on this. The Ukrainians are not doing what they had agreed to originally, and then keep going public in their complaints about we need ATACMS, we need F-16. So I think the nervousness here is, and even to get into more of your question with a supplemental, is the Republican Party, the Republican primaries, other than Mike Pence to a certain extent and some others, the rhetoric out of the presidential campaign and certainly on the Capitol Hill of real skepticism on first the far right, but the increasing right on funding the Ukrainians, that is going to become much more difficult for the Biden administration, particularly as tensions over the counteroffensive are building, and there's just not a lot of good news coming out of it. So I think we're running into a very, very difficult point. And it may be the reason, as Catherine pointed out, that the Ukrainians have in many ways needed a shift to a more diplomatic offensive to make sure they're not losing the public relations war in this one. Because I think that there's increasing tensions there that I think could get very, very complicated.
Catherine, you don't quite agree with the analysis.
I don't, I'm afraid. No, I mean, I'm very interested if that's what Peter's been told in Washington, but I would suggest that if he is being told that, then the Americans being extremely unfair on the Ukrainians. That they may, yes, of course, they're fighting, between 100 meters and a kilometer, perhaps, at the front line. No NATO army in the world would attempt what they are doing right now, including fighting at that proximity without air cover. It just doesn't happen anymore. And the Russians have it. And the Russians are jamming and shooting down Ukrainian drones almost as soon as the Ukrainians can launch them. They are going into this with very little sight. So I think for the Americans to blame the Ukrainians for their lack of progress on their failure to, no one's claiming they're perfect executors of combined arms warfare, but I still insist that despite the proximity of this is absolutely down to the fact they have not been given the tools for the job. And by the way, even when you're fighting at this proximity to one another, you need the depth to hit the supply lines that are coming towards you. Why else is Russia hitting the whole of Ukraine with missiles at ranges of hundreds and hundreds of miles? So I do not dispute the frustrations in Washington, but I really can't imagine what they would expect. And I'd be shocked if the Pentagon felt the same way as about the Ukrainians' capabilities, because they would know that you simply do not undertake these kind of maneuvers without. I certainly
couldn't say where my sources are, but I just think that even this discussion we're having is indicative of the problem here, right? If this was going well, we would not be having this discussion, and it is exposed rifts that are going to fester. You know, the word I kept hearing from, again, almost every building I went to was, they got to get going. They got to get going. This window is closing. This window is closing. It's not going to get any easier. So there is a frustration in Washington with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are frustrated with the Americans because they keep saying that. So I guess even this discussion we're having now, where we sort of disagree about causes and effects and stuff like that, is indicative of what I'm trying to get at, which is it's going to get more and more painful for this coalition to stick together. And at a time where, particularly in the Washington political scene, it's only going to get more complicated as well because of the Republican noises going on, both in the president's campaign and in Capitol Hill.
Absolutely. And I would say that one of the greatest fears in Kyiv is a return to a Republican administration, particularly Donald Trump, within a year and a half.
Yeah, but I think Peter, your last point, which is, I think, Catherine, you rightly are underscoring not only the Ukrainian argument, but frankly, if you put any American general in the Ukrainian shoes, the argument you would hear. And at the same time, there are constraints to what the U.S. has imposed on itself on what it's willing to provide the Ukrainians, which then lead them to say you need to fight it in a slightly different way than we would fight it because you don't have the capacity or whatever. And so it is symptomatic of a larger issue, and in the end, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. What matters is that that this disagreement in and of itself is undermining the capacity to support, and I think it's worrisome. I would say that there are a large number of people in the Pentagon who share Peter's view, but they do so not because they care about warfare, but they care about maintaining their own ATACMs because they don't want to give them to the Ukrainians and a whole variety of other reasons that may not have to do with the battlefield condition, but with their own bureaucratic instincts. Welcome to the real world.
Well, I mean, just in fairness, bureaucratic instincts, but it's not like ATACMS are you can buy them off the shelf, right? There are American,
no. There is. I mean, there are only a few of them. There are not as many. And
there are contingencies in Asia that we were just talking about before that actually the Americans may need ATACMS for. So that's
no. Yeah. It's a complicated. It demonstrates that American Ukrainian interests are not always aligned. And that is a thing that I think we all need to bear witness to. Jamil, I want to bring you in, although I also want to get to Niger. So just a final point: the Europeans are also providing arms in one form or another. But how is the absence of a counteroffensive and the diplomatic initiative been seen in Brussels and other corridors of power?
Yeah, well, as we've talked about several times on the show, the Europeans have always been a bit mushier than the Americans, and certainly the Western Europeans are a lot mushier than the Eastern Europeans, put it that way. The fatigue that I've been predicting for a long time hasn't set in as much as I might have expected by this stage, but it's also I do think that there is fatigue, and when I talk to heads of state and people in diplomacy in Brussels, and they definitely talk about we can't be in this place next year, right? Like there's definitely that sense. So I think the similar frustrations that Peter's describing have been here all along and are probably a bit more heightened. But at the same time, Europe is not giving as much as the Americans. I mean, a tiny fraction, really. So it's it's an interesting moment. But I wouldn't say that. I think that the Europeans are happy that the Americans are bearing the brunt of providing support, and
that's a novel approach from the Europeans, right?
Yeah, very novel. Exactly.
Never heard that one before.
But I would also say that that the war feels far away, and it hasn't always felt as far away. And maybe people are just, it's not maybe just all fatigue. It's also people are just complacent. They've just gotten used to it. They go on their holidays, and they don't think about it very much. So,
and they got
that, I think, is also the flip side of, because the Ukrainians have really locked down on the information, partly because they aren't winning, but also because they don't want to give away any advantage. As a result, you're not seeing the horrific images of the Buchas and you're not seeing that in the same way that you were before, because Ukraine has really locked down the information environment, and as a result, it's even more out of sight, out of mind. So, and if you're not having to contribute that much, then the fatigue maybe isn't as intense.
Yeah, well, having covered Bucha, I can also point out that you can only see a Bucha once that land is taken back, and that's just not really happening at the moment. I mean, it's just not happening. Yeah, but also you're absolutely correct that when you go to Ukraine these days, it's a much less permissive environment for journalists than it was in the past, and there's just less movement.
In a few minutes we have left, Peter. Let's shift to the other really big story. Niger, a coup a couple of weeks ago. The third, I think, in the last 12 months in West Africa, and this time ECOWAS, the regional alliance, stood up, led this time by Nigeria, and said, if you don't reverse the coup and put the president back into power, the elected president back into power, we will intervene. That was a week ago when the deadline passed almost, and here we are. So one, how should we read what's going on? And two, what's the significance? Why should we care?
Yeah, let me try to address both those things very quickly here, because I think, unfortunately, even in today's conversation, what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the Sahel, which is just south of the Sahara, is being overlooked by the foreign policy community at our own risk. So, even in your intro, we started the show, Ivo, you said, hey, another coup in Africa. And I think the assumption here is yet another coup in Africa. And yet, as you point out, there are ramifications here that we need to pay attention to. One is, with the ECOWAS threat, there is a risk of a shooting war in West Africa, which, amongst many foreign policy people, Ben Wallace, the outgoing British defense secretary, has said one of my greatest concerns is the West gets pulled into a shooting war in Africa. It is, as you said, dissipated because ECOWAS has not followed up, and the Nigerians have not followed up in their threat to pull together a stabilization force or an invasion force to go into Niger. So that is dissipated, but it is still an issue that is worth watching. The bigger issue, though, I want to point out is the why is this important thing? Because I think this is where we're getting slightly lost. If you look at the Sahel, basically that strip of land below the Sahara, and I would include Somalia in that, which is not technically the Sahel, but is sort of on the right side of it. You have almost, I would say, a return to the bad old days, right? We have returned to ethnic warfare, Islamic extremism. I mean, we've forgotten about this and focusing on China and Ukraine over the last 5 years, that the threat of Islamism is still out there. You have Al-Shabaab in Somalia reemerging. You have Darfur, where you have sort of what was once the Janjaweed rebelling against the government. And now you have in West Africa a competition, I would say, between sort of ethnic and Islamist groups fighting sort of Western-backed democratic government, not just the U.S., mostly the French. And the third element in there is the Wagner Group, which has been in there backing many of these military dictators in Mali and elsewhere where they've faced the threat of Islamism. And so you have sort of a three-way battle for power now going on. You have French and American-backed, Western-backed, democratic largely regimes. You have the Russians backing essentially many of the military dictatorships, and then you have the Islamists making gains. And why Niger is important on this is Niger was in many ways the last man standing for the French and the Americans. They were Americans were training their military. The French had used President Barzum as sort of their last pro-French leader in the region. This is a country that, unlike the Brits, has not gone away from their African colonies. They have gone back and tried to be a bit of a paternalistic security provider. And so in many ways, Niger, if it does indeed fall, which it seems has been, is the last domino to fall. And in essence, particularly in West Africa, but across the Sahel, all the Western allies that we've worked so long to do capacity training in the post 9/11 world, to give them defense capabilities to fight Islamism, that has been completely wiped out over the last decade. And that's why Niger is important. It is in many ways the last domino that the Americans and the French had in that region to do their dirty work, for lack of a better word, to fight Islamism, to fend off the Russians. And it looks like they're closing in. The Islamists and the Russians and anti-Western interests in Africa, particularly in that region, are beginning to overtake the American and Western interests. And that's why it's important for American foreign policy. And I just worry that, given that we are so focused, and rightfully so, on Ukraine, China, that what is happening in Africa is not getting enough attention. And let's remember, that's where Osama bin Laden came from. He came from Sudan. In these ungoverned spaces in Africa, particularly where Islamism is gaining an upper hand, could potentially come back and bite us really hard.
Peter, that was great in 3-4 minutes. And just to emphasize the importance of your point, we've run out of time because we spend a lot of time on Russia, Ukraine, and China. And not enough. So as moderator, I blame myself deeply for this. Because
we always blame you anyway, Ivo. Don't worry.
Yeah, well, that's true. So
much like Xi Jinping, yes, you get all the blame and all the credit. Yeah.
That makes it easy. But I mean, I think the point you made is a very, very important one in terms of not losing focus. That the rest of the world, there is still a lot going on, and that big point about this may well be the end of France's presence in West Africa, and that is a fundamental change for France, for its own self-identity. It used to be said that about a certain country that lost an empire and hadn't found a role. Perhaps we can now say that pretty soon about the French. And with that, let me thank Peter Spiegel, Catherine Philp, and Jamil Anderlini for really an insightful analysis of this week's stories. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and have a great weekend.